just about ready to start, but we're waiting for a few more to be coming on. I think if you give us a few more patience.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Cindy, I just want to make sure that you, okay, perfect. Yeah, I didn't know if I had muted you.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. Okay, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. We are in broadcasting. I believe many of you are joining from all around the world. Thank you for joining us. We also are well aware that it is a very busy part of the weeks as we all round out the end of the year. So delighted that so many of you responded interest and to join us for the first part of a series of webinars that we are going to be holding starting from now until the coming 5 or 6 months. And my name is Cindy Coltman. I work for Both Ends and based in Amsterdam. And I'm going to ask Bridget and Don and to put on our webcams for a minute so we can wave a friendly hello to you. We are still waiting for one more speaker on our side, Titi Sudantoro from Indonesia. She will be joining us shortly. But Bridget, will you turn your webcam on and let me just let people see you and then we'll...
Hi, everyone. This is Bridget from WEDO.
Hi, everyone. This is Don from Both Ends.
And I'm Cindy from Both Ends. And we will turn ourselves off so that we don't burn up precious wavelength here. Okay, so as I said, this is the first part of a webinar series on women's rights and climate finance. This is meant to be an introduction, and the series is just a quick word about the background. The series is co-organized by WEDO, Both Ends as a member of the GAGGA, the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, and supported by Wallace Global Fund. And we're thrilled that we can start this series. As some of you may know, we sent out a survey a few months ago to get some input to the series, and Bridget will be going a little bit more in detail there. But for now, I think we have 3 speakers, and we're going to start. We're going to spend about 45 minutes probably having 3 presentations, and then we're going to, in between, I may ask if anybody has clarifying questions, please go ahead and use the question box or raise your hand if you're familiar with that. There should be a button there to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you so that and after our speakers present, we're hoping that even though it's sometimes difficult with so many of us online, that we could have a bit more questions and a bit more comments, and we'll go from there. And we'll see, and we're scheduled to end within an hour and a half, but if we're earlier, we're earlier, and otherwise, let's get started. Bridget?
Excellent. Thank you so much. I saw that there was already a question about not being able to hear, but I think that was, I believe that was when we weren't speaking. But is anyone else maybe in the question? Can you share if you are, can you just confirm that you're able to hear? Or perhaps I will unmute someone. Let's see. Margot, are you able to hear us?
Okay. I'm seeing people, a few people say no problems with audio, and she says she can hear now. So I think we're good for now.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, then I will just go ahead and get started. So as Cindy said, thank you for joining us today. I'm gonna, this is an overview of the agenda that we've planned for this. We really want to share with you the initiative and the work that we do in both ends as part of and alongside of all the networks and groups that we are part of, is putting forward with this initiative, and then look a little bit into, give an overview of the climate finance landscape. Obviously not a completely in-depth overview, because we're hoping to really hone in on different aspects of climate finance throughout this series of webinars. Dan is going to then specifically look at the GCF and what some of the opportunities and challenges have been with engaging in the GCF, and then TT will provide much more of a framing for why a Global South activist would be working in at the global level and bringing and connecting this back to the national level. And then we hope to have an open discussion with all of you. And so just a little bit of background, and Cindy already started sharing this, that this particular series of activities is part of a new partnership between WEDO and Both Ends as a member of the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, or GAGGA. And of course it builds on a lot of the work and activities that are being done by many networks working at the intersection of women's rights, climate change, and climate finance, the Women and Gender constituency at the UNFCCC, Women's Funds networks. We have incredible activists and researchers who have been doing a lot of work at this intersection of women's rights, gender, and climate change for many years now. So we do have a number of resources available, and this is really just some key activities that we see that can be enhanced and can be further resourced to be able to really build power in this space. The three key activities to the overall project that we have, which again is sort of, it's just putting a little bit of resources into a few activities that we think we can enhance further. One is working with women in environmental funds, potentially on accreditation to the Green Climate Fund, or understanding how direct access to the funds, what it could look like. And that is something that Both Ends is actually leading on as part of the GAGGA Alliance, and they can speak more to that. The second is this development of a GCF monitor network. And really this is about building on the work that many of us do as women's rights and environmental activists, in terms of building power by participating in processes, monitoring, tracking them, being at board meetings, intervening in those policy spaces. And so this is intended to provide the participation support to women from Africa, Latin America, and Asia Pacific to actually monitor and track the work of the GCF. And then, of course, this webinar series. And the key objectives for the webinar series is to enhance a broad range of understanding on the climate finance landscape, to build knowledge of how to access this information on what finance is flowing to your region or your country. There's a lot of information out there that's been created by the mechanisms, by activists, to try to figure out how we can track and influence the flows of funding that are coming. Strategies for how to organize and impact, monitor, or resist projects being put forward in your country or region. Strategies for organizing as women's groups globally, regionally, to track climate finance, and how do we enhance direct access for women's groups. So these are some of the objectives in terms of the questions that we hope to explore and that we would like to get everyone engaging in to figure out how we can build these strategies more cohesively. So we did reach out to a number of people to ask for, their feedback on what this webinar series should touch on and how it should be structured. We were so pleased. We got 79 responses from around 50 countries. And so these are just some of the highlights from the feedback that that many of you have given about this webinar series, there's a pretty even split in terms of people feeling familiar with climate finance mechanisms, particularly the climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, etc. Most people responded that they were kind of in the middle. They had heard of them, but they might not be well versed in the policies and procedures. And then we asked for to pick which topics you'd like to see discussed in this webinar series. The most requested topics were around strategies for local access for women's groups, how gender has been integrated into the currently funded climate finance projects, and then looking more in depth into gender policies and plans of the funds themselves. And this is just a quote here that I pulled out. The webinar series should provide resources, information, and support to local women on how to track climate finance from dedicated climate finance mechanisms and other sources. Understanding how to initiate advocacy to hold government to account at the local levels is also very critical. So again, I think this idea is, and these ideas is what we've tried to bring into the potential future topics, and we will share what we think those future topics might be, but we really are open for feedback and thoughts on what more could be provided and shared. We have had a number of questions on translation, rightly so, and of course we really want to make sure that the resources and tools that are provided are accessible. We are aiming to have all the webinar sessions available in English, French, and Spanish. For this first webinar, the plan that we have is to translate the slides that are being presented and also have a transcript of the recording translated. Which we hope we can perhaps put over the video. We're reviewing the possibilities for simultaneous webinar translation for future sessions. This is budget dependent. We don't have a huge budget for this work, but I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way. And so we also have the potential of repeating sessions in different time zones. We also have the intention of linking further webinars after June in 2018 with regional GCF monitors. So as I said before, one aspect of the program is a GCF monitor network, and the idea is that those who are leading in different regions, maybe in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia, would host trainings and webinars regionally in different languages as well, and that's something that, again, we're really open to feedback and suggestions from those who've had experience in delivering webinars in multiple languages, because we do want to make it accessible. And even English, French, and Spanish is not fully covering the range of languages that there are. So again, these are our tentative dates and topics. You'll see that we sort of have a planned monthly webinar starting from next year in February. One is what we're hoping to look really specifically at gender and the climate finance mechanisms. So for that, we're thinking mostly about, and I'm missing one here, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and the CIF, which I will mention again in my next slides, and take a deep dive into how gender has been considered in terms of the policies and the projects there. Another one is around GCF accreditation and enhanced direct access. So this is sort of thinking about what direct access looks like, what it could look like. What does that mean in terms of the different the different climate funds that exist? What could it mean in terms of specifically getting accreditation to the Green Climate Fund, and is that a valid option? The next is around strategies for organizing to influence, monitor, and track climate finance. So what does it look like to effectively engage in these things to really impact change at national, and what kind of organizing is needed at local level in order to influence the flows. And then as a last piece, funding for gender justice and climate justice outside of the major climate mechanisms. Where is funding that's coming up? How are donor governments, UN agencies, private foundations funding at this intersection? What are the potential challenges with that? What do we need to be aware of, and what should we be calling for? So again, this is something as we go through today, when we open back up for discussion, we're very, very happy for suggestions or thoughts and feedback related to these topics, and we will, you know, they are very much tentative at the moment, what was said in that original feedback session, but also be flexible to ideas that come forward as we have these webinars. So I'm going to really, really briefly provide a few slides, and there are more resources that I think are for you for further review outside of this webinar in terms of what we're talking about when we say climate finance and what landscape we're going to be specifically looking at in this project and through this webinar series. So, and it's interesting because here are the definitions, if you will, some definitions of what we mean when we talk about climate finance. However, one of the key questions about climate finance is how do you actually measure it and what counts as climate finance? And that's a very political issue, particularly in terms of some of the principles of climate finance being new and additional resources, because if we're counting what funding has already been there that's being repackaged as climate finance, it doesn't meet that principle. But in general, these are financial resources invested in mitigation and adaptation measures through financial instruments. And this can include loans, grants, and guarantees, which have helped leverage additional private finance. So as I'll show in the next two slides, we will likely focus a lot of our attention in terms of the influence and advocacy on the public finance instruments that exist, as in our advocacy for pushing for more public finance. But of course, understanding where private finance is coming from and what people mean when they count climate finance and private finance as climate finance is really important to understand to do advocacy. So again, the sources of climate finance can be public, private, or the intermediaries, so those who receive the funds to pass the funds forward. The instruments, we talk about climate finance instruments, so tools, mechanisms, and modalities. So that can include a financing mechanism that deliver the funds, for example. The uses, usually when we're talking about climate finance, the uses for mitigation or adaptation. And then you'll hear a lot of conversation about readiness funding, readiness financing. So this is what financing is available to plan for climate projects and activities to access climate finance, plan and build capacity to deliver, and plan and build capacity to monitor. So there are a number of readiness funds available for developing countries in particular, and how do you understand and sort of look into where that readiness funding exists. So this is one, again, very overwhelming, if you will, of graph, but also really important graph that has been done by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, North America, and the Overseas Development Institute. And just a shout out to Leanne Shalatek, who has taught me everything and anything I know about climate finance. So I want to give credit to the immense amount of work that she has done in this field, but also particularly on linking gender and climate finance. And so this is a diagram that comes from this partnership, and it looks at the global climate finance architecture in terms of public resources. There is one area of this which looks at private. There's just one block here which you see is private, but the rest of this is about public financing, which you can see comes either directly from the contributor countries or from multilateral institutions. And it also includes a list of some of the regional and national funds that exist. And you can see that there are, from the contributions, you have things going to bilateral institutions, and there's so many acronyms here, it's not necessarily worth going through all of them to help understand them. However, I would recommend this text or this diagram is actually further elaborated in the Climate Finance Fundamentals Guide that that Heinrich Boll and the Overseas Development Institute have created. And these guides are available in English and French. They're each about 3 pages, and there are, I think there's at least 10 of them now, which looks at several different aspects of climate finance. They're really 101s to the fundamentals of climate finance, what climate finance looks like in relation to adaptation or mitigation. There's one on gender and climate finance. So again, as stated before, there are a lot of materials and resources that have been created to help people navigate what this overall funding landscape looks like. And then this is another type of landscaping that's been created, this by the Climate Policy Initiative, which takes into account looking at private sources of finance as well. So here the calculation in terms of public financing, or here the calculation is that between 2015 and 2016, there's actually 410 billion US dollars, an annual average, related to what kind of money is flowing in to work on climate finance or climate change issues. And here, if you look at this chart, of that 410 billion, 139 billion, or 33% of that, comes from those public financing sources, which are the bilateral aid agencies, export credit agencies, UN institutions, the MDBs, the national development banks, so all the development finance institutions, and then the climate funds, which there are more of, but as you'll see later, we will really probably be focusing a lot in the initial stages on the policies, plans, and projects of the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and the Climate Investment Funds. So even looking back to that slide, of that 410 billion, what they have calculated is 270 billion, or 65% of the total of climate finance flows coming from private sources. That includes project developers, so national or regional utilities, independent power producers of renewable energy, corporate actors, corporate end users and manufacturers, private households in terms of economic entities, at the family level, institutional investors, so insurance companies, pension funds, endowments, commercial financial institutions, private equity, venture capital, and infrastructure funds. So this is a whole other host of funding and resources that have been calculated by some, and by some policy institutes, towards the overall work on climate change. And this is an area that I think is really important for women's rights activists and environmental activists to understand how that is being calculated, but also what the end products and the end outcomes of this financing is, because this is one of the areas where we do also see a lack of influence and also a lack of control over what kinds of projects and outcomes that we're seeing. So just a reflection on the need that there is, so that there's been estimates beyond this as well, of course, but one of the estimates that the OECD and the IEA have come up with, and I'm going to explain acronyms where necessary, but there's a lot throughout this, so I will say that NDCs are nationally determined contributions. So these are the national climate plans of countries, the climate contributions, sorry, that they've put forward to the Paris Agreement with the intention of keeping warming, or towards keeping warming under 2 degrees. However, we know that those currently aren't even ambitious enough to get us to that level. And there's a calculation that particularly the energy sector needs an investment of at least 13.5 trillion in energy efficiency from 2015 to 2030, and low carbon technologies, excuse me, representing almost 40% of the total energy sector. So even when, you know, we're talking about the need for public financing and the promise to get to 100 billion in that public financing, which we are well behind, but the real need, of course, is even much larger than that to actually meet the need of implementing nationally determined contributions. And again, thinking about this landscape, it's ever changing, and there's always new funding and resources coming in. So as an example of that, in recent news, the president, excuse me, there was recently a summit held by Macron in France called the One Planet Summit, which many of you might have heard about. And one of the big pieces of news coming out of that is that the EU announced a $9 billion in funding for climate action. This was a big headline in The Guardian. The EU funds will be focused on clean energy and sustainable cities and agriculture, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also pledging $300 million towards climate adaptation. And so again, this is one of those areas where we see a really big commitment potentially of funding, resources, $9 billion that are going to be coming into different countries and different regions. What does this funding look like? What is it going to be used for? Where is it going to be going to? Is this a really new and additional funding, or is this a repackaging of existing funds within the EU? I haven't had a chance to explore what that looks like, so I don't have the answer to that, but it's certainly the question I would ask. And you know, when you have something like a new commitment from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I know that will go not only towards climate adaptation, but has said to want to have a significant focus on energy investments with that focus on women. So again, what do women's rights activists have to say about that? What lessons have we learned? Is there things that we would caution on? How do we ensure we're part of that decision-making process from the beginning? Again, as I mentioned before, we're going to be looking a lot at these 4 main climate funds, and this is a graph to show you what they look like in terms of actual percentage of funding of overall public funding. And so the Green Climate Fund is obviously the largest fund, and this is in terms of pledges at the moment. But there's also a significant amount of funds in the Climate Investment Fund, particularly the Clean Technology Fund. And there are other lessons to be learned, for example, from the Adaptation Fund in terms of enhancing direct access. But part of the reason why we will be spending a lot of time looking at how to influence the GCF is because many of us have engaged for a number of years in these other funds, have learned lots of lessons from what has happened in those funds, and know that there will be, in all likelihood, the Green Climate Fund will continue to be the largest fund, bringing what's supposed to be billions of dollars into countries. And so trying to, from the beginning, make sure that power is built in that space to actually influence that process becomes really important. And I wanted to point out really, really, really useful tool, the Climate Funds Update website, which again is done by Heinrich Boll and a number of other organizations, but I'm forgetting them at the moment. And the Climate Funds Update is a great website for finding out what resources are available, not just in these funds, but across a number of different public funding mechanisms. You can do a lot of data calculations yourself to drill down to regional funding flows and get really updated information on each of those. So this is a website I would recommend you visiting and testing out and seeing what information you can gather from it. So why focus again? I've mentioned in a couple of other slides and different points why this focus on women's rights and climate finance. Of course, this is partly and in part because climate change, as we know, intersects with gender equality and women's human rights, both in terms of, specifically in terms of impacts, whether it's water scarcity, fuel shortage, food insecurity, and disasters. We know that climate change is really an exacerbator of inequalities that already exist, and that women have not been equally part of decision-making processes on what type of solutions need to be put forward. And this is really the piece where I think the climate finance piece becomes really important, because it's not just the impacts of climate change that intersect with gender equality and women's human rights, but it's also the responses that are implemented and how they are implemented. it's really critical, it's fundamental, I think, that feminist and women's rights voices have a say in the type of solutions that should be financed, what will actually lead to shifts in paradigms towards sustainable development, and how they can center the voices and experience of women, grassroots and indigenous peoples and women. And we know that human rights abuses can happen whether the project is true or false. And I say that because we talk a lot about false solutions within the networks and constituencies that we work in. And there's definitely false solutions out there. And I'll mention that in my next point. But when it comes to true solutions, or solutions, for example, like a large-scale renewable energy project that's a solar project that would seemingly be something that, yes, will help climate, we know that large-scale infrastructure projects that are done without consent or without processes for consent can have significant consequences for human rights as well: land grabbing, violence, relocation. And so I think that we see how critical and important it is that true, community engagement in what kinds of projects are being put forward at national and local level need to be a significant part of this process of transition. And we know, so those are the true solutions, and where we have false solutions, and we see a lot of this, so solutions that are only upholding business as usual, aren't really transitioning communities into more decentralized and renewable systems. They have human rights abuse impacts right in the here and now, but also, of course, in the future, for really, really not allowing communities and countries to develop in a sustainable way. So the mechanisms are not working to channel funding to local groups, women's rights activists. They're not built fit for purpose in that way, in terms of being able to deliver direct financing and access. The prevailing approaches to reducing emissions in project design continue to prioritize scientific and technological measures, often at the expense of, rather than inclusive of, social and behavioral considerations. A lot of the challenges become part of the systemic structures of these mechanisms, with money going to mitigation, supporting large-scale energy infrastructure and industrial efficiency programs, which unfortunately are often considered gender blind. This is something you see quite clearly in the climate investment funds, where the largest fund that they have is the Clean Technology Fund. And while they've been progress in some projects, including aspects of gender and women's rights related to adaptation and resilience, you see almost all, although things are shifting now, for the majority of the implementation phase, almost all of the projects put forward through the Clean Technology Fund have been gender blind. And another increasingly challenging aspect is that adaptation projects are often prioritizing retrofitting infrastructure deemed to be at risk from climate change over transformative projects that will focus on people and communities. At the same time as all of that, though, all of the climate funds that we've listed do have plans or policies for these funds to be gender responsive, many making a link to CEDAW, to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and to other human rights instruments. So there is work being done in terms of building capacity of what that should look like. There's experiences and work on how you can actually create channels, if not for direct access, for ensuring that local women's groups are part of investment plans, strategies, and projects of different funding mechanisms. So there are a huge amount of challenges, but the institutional structure is there to recognize and to use some of the other instruments we have from women's rights, kind of normative human rights language, to influence these processes. And again, there is a recognition, even amongst countries, that these are critical issues and that climate finance must be gender responsive, and that there are these challenges that continue to exist. For example, at the most recent UNFCCC session, COP23, you might know there was a gender action plan that was decided on. And there's a lot more to say and come out about what that gender action plan can actually do. But there are two activities specifically related to finance. And I've highlighted where I think it's important to recognize that people and countries are recognizing that access to finance is really the critical issue. And so in 2019, there'll be a standing committee on finance dialogue that is about emphasizing what has been done in the different finance mechanisms to ensure the implementation of gender-responsive access to finance. And that is, again, something that we can utilize as an opportunity to really build knowledge, power, stories on how that's happening or how it's not. And then there's also an activity to strengthen the capacity of gender mechanisms, including parliamentarians, the IP, the International Parliamentary Union, non-governmental organizations, on the integration of gender-responsive budgeting into climate finance, access, and delivery. And so again, here, I think what the Gender Action Plan does is open a call for many different institutions to say this is a focus that we want to have in support of implementing the GAP on really enhancing gender-responsive budgeting and climate finance. So this is my last slide, and I sort of just want to wrap up in terms of looking at that incredibly broad landscape and all of the different aspects of it to really unpack. You can have a whole series of webinars just on one of those different climate finance funds. You can also have a whole series of discussions on how do you unpack private climate finance and what does it look like. And I think for us, you know, there's no one strategy and there's no one focus area that's going to really be the most important thing that we do in terms of building power in this space to access and to challenge what is climate finance and how do we actually combat climate change. And so part of this is really part of an overall inside-outside strategy that we continue to have across many different processes. And you know, one element of that is thinking about the direct access piece. So how do we actually directly access funding? Is that through having women funds engaged in a consortium to engage as an accredited entity to the GCF? Does that make sense as a strategy in terms of bringing funding to local women's groups? There's the indirect work that we need to continue to do. And part of the GCF Monitor Network, for example, is about doing this indirect work where we're doing advocacy to push, for example, for dedicated grant mechanisms. That's what DGM stands for within the Green Climate Fund, or perhaps criteria and other mechanisms which focuses on funding for women's groups and projects. What can we do to influence indirectly the projects that are being put forward in the current mechanisms that exist by participating, by monitoring, by tracking them. And then we also have the paradigm shifting power strategies that we need to have, which is actually about either challenging for more money or challenging the way that these financial structures are set up. And all of these different types of advocacy strategies are important for us to look at and think about where we need to build power in that way. One of that is challenging where money is not going into climate finance. So you have the Move the Money campaigning, which we have, the Women and Gender constituency have tried to integrate a lot more into our climate change advocacy about, you know, linking this substantive need that we have for transitioning to a low carbon society versus what money is actually there versus what money is being put into military spending and infrastructure, for example. Or demanding alternatives. So focusing instead of on these structures, focusing on community financial structures that need to exist, or campaigns to call for tax justice so that more public financing is actually available to invest in environment and social solutions. So it's not to say that any one strategy is more important than the other. It's that I think we need to have a full picture of these different types of strategies in order to decide how to build the strongest type of inside-outside strategy against the landscape of incredible need of billions of dollars being flowing into countries on the face of projects that are supposed to be supporting climate action, and how we need to be able to build decision-making capacity, knowledge, and decision-making power in that space. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass back to Cindy. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. That was enormously powerful and so much detailed information as well. So I think that it was an excellent start to, you know, kind of give us all a chance to take a step back and say, what is climate finance? And that, we're going to unpack a lot more of this as the series goes on. So thank you for that wonderful begin. Bridget, I'm going to take a moment to letting you know 2 questions, because I think then we will move to the next speakers. But right in the beginning, I think it's worthwhile reflecting on the first 2 questions you got when we talked about how the webinar series will develop. You had one question from Maite van der Mark about when we talk about Asia, are we including Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan? And I believe the answer is yes to that, correct?
Yes, although I think that there's also the as we would build in different regions, I think, of course, Africa as a region does not encompass, of course, all the different sub-regions within that, and so the hope would be that there would need to be an even stronger focus on particular sub-regions within different geographical regions, if you will.
Okay, great. And the second question from Asaba Shahu, I'm not sure if this was something that we have an immediate answer for, but she was asking if which plans do we have in the webinar series for rural women in sub-Saharan Africa? So I think, yeah. Asaba, I might unmute you to see if you want to actually jump in yourself to clarify what you meant.
Hello, good afternoon.
Asaba, can you hear us?
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My first one is, what plans do you have for rural women in sub-Saharan Africa?
And did you mean regarding the webinar series, making sure we can reach the information to them, or did your question come from another place?
Regarding the information to the rural women.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a couple of answers to that. One is that of course, at a very, very basic level, it's hoping that we can make these tools available through our different networks so that people can, on their own time, watch and listen and go to different sites that are needed. When it comes to how can we work directly with rural women in different parts of different regions, this is part, I think that it's sort of a step-by-step building process, and part of the reason for creating, for example, and it's not creating, I mean, so many regional networks already exist, but it's trying to put some sort of feedback infrastructure in place where, and we know that CSO observers are already doing this, engaging in the Green Climate Fund, but if we have a monitor or several monitors coming from Africa that are understanding what projects are being put forward, what accredited entities are coming about or should come about in Africa, that they would be working with regional and local and rural networks in different communities to develop some sort of strategy for how to engage in this very broad landscape of climate financing, and where's the push and pull. Of course, there's so much organizing that is happening already at local and national level, and it's also a feedback channel for how that work can influence those doing advocacy at a global policy level as well. So, one of the intentions is to really learn from all of the activists who will be engaging in the Green Climate Fund, and have them start to develop, not the coordinators, but have the monitors develop a toolkit for grassroots advocacy in climate financing, for example. So I think it's a kind of step-by-step process, and it's really more about creating those channels where the leadership can come from those who are leading at local area, etc.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Asaba, I'm going to unmute you for the moment then. That's okay. And I'm going to suggest, Bridget, there are a few more other questions, but I think what I'm going to suggest is that we have Don present now. We'll give you a chance to actually look through some of the other comments. There's some comments as well. And then when we go greater discussion, we probably can pick up some of these other feedback, which is great. Keep it coming, please. Now I'm going to, we're going to switch gears. Don Robin from both ends is going to talk about climate finance and hone in a little more about, little background more for the Green Climate Fund, so that when we talk later in the series more about the Green Climate Fund, everybody at least has a basic, the same basis is what we're thinking. Okay, so I'm going to pass the mouse to Don very carefully. There you go.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Robin, as Cindy said. I work at both ends, and I've been following the GCF proceedings for almost 2 years now. I've been attending many of the board meetings in the past 2 years. I was asked to touch upon a couple of elements, or the main elements of the GCF. And like Cindy, but also Bridget already explained, we will dive deeper into those aspects later on. So the GCF is the new financial mechanism under the UNFCCC and made its first steps in 2010. It became operational in 2015. I need to put my next slide. Yes, sorry about that. It is the first fund solely devoted to finance climate change projects in developing countries only. And it targets the most vulnerable. Oh, by the way, when I said it became operational, it meant that the first projects were approved, and it was in 2015 in the board meeting in Zambia. The GCF claims to be transformational and paradigm shifting, and that means that it aims to deliver projects with transformational impacts, which aim to create a paradigm shift in countries. And basically, how it works is that developed countries, they pledge money into the fund, and developing countries can spend it on climate change mitigation and adaptation. So some of the main, some of the main features of the fund are it is aspiring to be the largest dedicated climate fund globally. It focuses on maximizing country ownership, and it aims to have a balance between adaptation projects and mitigation projects, 50-50 division. It claims to have a diversified portfolio of finance partners. And in this case, we got a finance partners accredited entities, which can be direct access entities or international access entities. And the difference between that is that international direct access entities are entities within a country that can only work in that country, while international access entities are basically the business as usual players, like the large development banks, like private sector entities, or UN entities. So, and it also has a diversified portfolio of financial instruments. That's what it aims for. Okay. So how does it work? The Green Climate Fund is now based in Korea, in Songdo, and the board convenes there 3 to 4 times a year. There are 12 board members from developing countries and 12 from developed countries, and it has a decision-making system of consensus, which is sometimes very complicated. Yeah, this picture is from early 2017, and you see the gender balance is very off at that moment. I just checked today what the status is of the board members now, and it's 11 women and 13 men, so it's a little bit better, but still we need to improve this. Yeah, so besides the board, what actors are there? So I just spoke about the accredited entities, which are the intermediaries that needs to go through a accreditation process. Don't need any slides. Okay, and when they are accredited,
We do that.
Sorry, can you not see the slide anymore?
We can see it, but we have at least one person who's not seeing the slides. But okay, I think it's okay now. Sorry, Don. Continue.
Yeah, so I was talking about accredited entities, which are the intermediaries. They need to go through an accreditation process. And when they are accredited, they can propose projects and bring them to the fund for financing. They can be local, national, or international, and can be from a wide range of backgrounds. So from NGOs to private parties to government agencies. Yeah. And in the national context, there is the NDA, the National Designated Authority, which is the national unit of the government that has the task to communicate between stakeholders in the country and with the GCF at the international level. So I will touch upon lightly on this. So. Because we will go into detail very much in later webinars. But the GCF is in certain ways a forerunner on gender. It has been the first climate fund to adopt gender as a key component in its policies from the start. It has a gender policy and a gender action plan. Although we are now, we just finished with a CSO input on the new Green Climate Fund Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Plan, which is a little bit different. So we are waiting at that process. It has the GCF has taken initiatives towards improving the situation on gender. So on paper, and there is a gender focal point that we can cooperate with. However, if we look at what's been happening in practice, there's still a long way to go. For example, there are still accreditations happening without a gender policy. The gender action plans and assessments are of very different quality, and there's still no standalone budget for a gender specialist. Yeah. So if we look at where the GCF is now, of the perceived 100 billion that we're aiming for in 2020, there's now 10.3 pledged, and there are now 54 projects since the last board meeting in Egypt, and starting from 2015, and there were 2.7 billion US dollars. So we're still way off track, actually. When we're looking at the projects, I just want to give you a brief example why it's very important to keep improving the efficiency of the CSO community, especially from the gender side. Because I just want to make a comparison between two projects we have seen. One was from Ethiopia. It was called Responding to the Increasing Risk of Drought, Building Gender Responsive Resilience of the Most Vulnerable Communities. And the other one I wanted to talk about is a project in Tajikistan. It's a hydropower project. So both of these projects, one from UNDP and later from MOFAC, that's the Ministry of Finance and Economy in Ethiopia, and the other projects from EBRD, they were criticized for having the climate dimension was too unclear, and there were a couple of other issues with these projects. However, if you look at the mandate of the GCF, the Ethiopian project was focusing on gender and on the most vulnerable, while the Tajikistan project had a lot of CSO critics on lack of consultations, for example. what happened was that the Tajikistan project got approved without big problems, while the Ethiopian project was rejected at first, and it came back later, reduced by half, and now, in a way lighter form. And this shows that although the GCF claims to focus very much on gender and on gender sensitiveness, this is also an example that we have a long way to go. So, I'm waiting for the next slide. Yeah. So, what do we do as a CSO community? There are a couple of possibilities. There is space for improving gender in the GCF. There are call for inputs, and we just finished one. That is a call for input is an official ask from the GCF to input on drafts of new policies. We work as a CSO community with a listserv, like I'm sure many of you know. Everybody can add their input, and we always try to really reach out to local partners and to people that are knowledgeable in this field. Then during board meetings, we convene as a CSO community to try to advocate for important issues during board meetings. So how it works, we have one active observer from the southern constituency, which was Lady Nakpil for the past 2 years, and one for the northern CSO community. It was the already very much and deservedly praised Liana Shalatek for the past 2 years. And they are in the boardroom, and they can serve as the link between the CSOs during board meetings, and they will present the inputs from the CSOs during the board meeting. I think equally important and equally more important is that we build capacity at national level. As we see more and more projects getting approved and more accredited entities coming in, we really in need of local input and local capacity from within the countries where that happens, especially on gender, which is a very neglected field at the moment. Not neglected, but underrepresented, I would say. So this project comes in very well, and this is the part where the GCF monitors are of invaluable worth. So before I hand over to Titi Santoro, I want to highlight some challenges and needs that we have as a CSO community. Like I said, we lacking awareness and capacity to assess projects and policies, especially within countries, and that's why we're very excited to be in this project. We always are in a fight to claim a meaningful space for CSOs at the international level, but we also should work on claiming a meaningful space for CSOs at national levels, so that is with NDAs and accredited entities. And for many of us, this is a recognizable challenge. We need long-term funding for CSOs to continue this work, because understanding the procedures is quite difficult. It's not easy to just step in this process and give the feedback that is recommended. So we need people that can really work on this for a long time. So what do we need? I will not talk longer about it much more, but what we need is more sudden leadership in the CSO group, following board meetings, as well as leadership at national levels. And we need a better information flow to civil society ahead of board meetings on projects or on entities to be accredited. And when I talk about sudden leadership, this is a good opportunity to introduce Titi Santoro, which will speak from a sudden perspective on CSO engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. So Titi Santoro from AXI Indonesia. We are lucky that Titi is actually in Amsterdam this week. So Titi, I'm going to, we missed you in the beginning when we did the subcommittee chemical, so we're going to let you wave, and then we're going to let you start. Here we go. Hello.
Greetings from the cold Amsterdam. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. As already Dan and Cindy introduced me, I'm Titi Suntoro from Aksi for Gender, Social and Ecological Justice. I've been following the GCF board meetings and the processes. Not every board meeting, but since Paris meeting in 2013. And how is to do the next? Okay, so the question is why we need to be involved in monitoring the GCF. There are two main reasons that we think important to consider. First, there's a lot of money coming into our countries. Dan already informed us how big the money will be coming for projects. And we know our country. Mostly we are living in the non-democratic country where the development is designed with the top-down approach, and there is an issue of ignorance to the human rights, violation of human and women's rights, and then non-transparent in government spending or government's sources of money. And then, of course, we see corruption and also non-accountable behavior of the government officials. So that's our country is this like this. And then on the other hand, if we look at the GCF, it's already explained in detail also by Bridget. So the emphasis of GCF, if we look, is on the low carbon economic part for developing country. It means really looking solely how to reduce the carbon emission. And then on the other hand, not put priority on the environmental sustainability or rights of people who are already affected by the climate crisis. So I can give you one example about this. We are concerned, for example, that the GCF really promote the geothermal as a source of energy that will be supported and financed. But there is no really critical discourse whether the geothermal is not affected the environment, because geothermal really needs a lot of water, and many cases already show how it affects the water sources of the community. So it shows for us that this is also something that we need to be careful if we look at the GCF finance. Thanks. All right. Sorry, I need help. Yeah. Oops. So, not the other one before? Oh, yes, okay. So, therefore, our role is actually to ensure that all the policy that have committed to protect, which is the safeguard policy, the information disclosure and accountability, is applied and implemented in each projects. And we need also to ensure that the gender policy and gender action plan are applied and implemented. Also ensure that country ownership with the emphasis of CSO engagement in the decision making related to the non-objection procedures or country programming, because the NDA, many NDA, the National Designated Authority, think that their solely work is actually giving stamp for no objection letter for applicant of the accreditation or projects. But actually, the NDA should play a role, that really their roles within the GCF, which is ensuring that the needs of the countries are reflected in the projects. And also important for us also is the CSO engagement, so we can monitor the implementation, the whole proposal to the GCF. And it's also important to ensure that the participation of civil society and local communities in decision-making processes are provided, and can be checked within all documents of the GCF. So, for examples, ensure that there is a bottom-up approach in designing program and projects. We see in some projects proposal within the GCF that this issue, the consultation with local communities, are lacking, but still projects were approved. So it's really our work to monitor and to ensure it. And also we need to ensure that institution or organization with backtrack record and environment, or the organizations that deal with the coal or fossil fuel business or have a bad track record in a human rights violation are not accredited as a GCF entity, and then also not play a role as implementing entity later on. So you see in the pictures, it was the action by civil society during the 17 board meetings to suggest to the board for not approving the accreditations of Japan because of that record. And of course, that's not easy to do this monitoring of the GCF, particularly for the Southern activists whose mother language is not English, because one board meeting can involve like 20 agenda items with 20 documents and more, and we need to read it. And it is not a love story novels, it is like a technical language that, somehow we have to deal with that, and we have to master it, that we know and we are familiar with those languages. So it's really need a lot of efforts. But of course, we can do it if we have to be confident on that. So one of the activities we have done, for example, to strengthen the involvement and capacity of the Southern activists are like capacity building, like training on the GCF, usually prior to the GCF board meetings. And then if involvement in the CSO strategy meeting, because then we discuss per item. We discuss what is the meaning of the statement, what our view on that, and we can debate whether we agree or not, and then having a common understanding and a common position on that. It is discussed among the Southern NGO, and then we have another debate in the Northern South-North strategy meeting, and then we go to the ECF board meeting. And we also have a strategy meeting whenever we have the time, for example, during the COPs of UNCCC. And then one of the exercise also to give input for joint submission to the any documents, draft documents, or to the CSO observer interventions. And another important work to do is outreach to other CSO and local grant makers through workshops at national level. So it means it makes other CSO colleagues aware that there is a GCF and what will be the implication, and also trying to find a good projects from the ground that can be financed, not only projects that good in the what you get question in the quotation according to the big international accredited entities, but what we think is actually important for the local communities. And then important also to have international network and on GCF monitoring. So there are two lists that we can join and then got informations. And important to have also national CSO network monitoring on GCF. In Indonesia, we have a WhatsApp group on that. So for us, it's easier to communicate now through WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then guidebook, as you see, there's a pictures of our guidebook in cooperation, collaborative with both ends, Samdana and AXI. It's like an introduction on GCF that we can use for capacity building and outreach to other groups, also government, local government official who are looking for funding for the city program, for example, and other good initiatives. I think that's all for now. That's the activities.
Thank you. Very nice. That was excellent. Okay, so we have some time now for a more general discussion and to handle also some of the questions that came about while Don, Titi, and Bridget were talking earlier. So I'm going to, Bridget, you were also, Bridget, will you lead off a little bit in terms of, is there a question that came up that you'd like us to start with, or give me a chance to kind of scroll down here?
Sure. I mean, I think it would be great to collect 1 or 2 or 3 comments and questions. I saw if, I don't know if Teresa is still on, but she raised a really interesting point around the Gates program. So I'm going to unmute her to maybe share that, and then I'm still also reading some of this, but there's a number of questions on the GCF. One that I'll put out that perhaps Dan, I can speak to as well, but Elaine Zuckerman, she's, I believe, on the phone. She wrote a question saying during the GCF design years, many CSOs tried to curtail World Bank and other IFI influence in the GCF policies and spending. So to what extent do the World Bank and other MDBs influence the GCF lending? Is it just as intermediaries? Are they still having a very significant influence in the GCF process? So that's one question. And then I'm going to unmute Teresa. You're unmuted. Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Bridget, Dan, and Titi. That was really excellent, very useful. So I will just make a small point that links back to something that Bridget raised probably in the first 10 minutes of the webinar, but just that others might be interested to know about. You mentioned the One Planet Summit that was held on Tuesday, at which there were many announcements and initiatives, and some of which were probably quite good and some of which we're not sure how good or new they are. One of the things one of the reasons why we are so strongly in favor of public finance is because it's more transparent and accountable, and we have to be quite careful when private announcements are made, because sometimes they can really suit the big businesses and individuals that are promoting and making these announcements. So we saw Bill Gates' big announcement that he was providing $300 million for adaptation in Africa, and most of the media thought, wow, that's great, thank you, Bill. But I've been following Bill Gates' engagement in adaptation and agriculture in Africa for many years now, and he's really pushing GMOs very, very strongly under the guise of philanthropy. So it's really something to watch out for. He talked very specifically about the need for Africa to have adapted seeds and etc. So I'm quite confident that this is just yet another effort to push GMOs onto Africa, even though smallholder farmers movements have strongly been rejecting GMOs in Africa because, of course, they're worried that GMOs mean that they will be forbidden from saving their seeds, and that corporate concentration will push smallholder farmers off the land. As we have seen, wherever GMOs have been grown, smallholder farmers have suffered. So, so we suspect that this is very much in alliance with USAID and Monsanto, who are keen to open up Africa for new markets. So that's why this discussion that we have about public finance under the GCF is where a lot of our demands need to go, because private finance can be quite dodgy. Not always, but sometimes.
Excellent, thank you. I think that it's a really important example, and partly why it was in there, because I think that so much of the work that we all need to do, and it's hard because there's sort of an onslaught of all of it, but is continual unpacking of what the money means, where it's going towards, and how we can hold it accountable to both human rights provisions as well as national policies and local community demands. So I had asked that question that Elaine asked, but I don't know, I can give over to you, Cindy, in case you've had a chance to look through the questions and want to ask people to raise them.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Don would like to address the question that you read out for him, and then there's a question from Jeanette Gurdung. And Jeanette, if you're still online, which I think you are, I'm going to unmute you because you have a question that I think TT can actually, and it's a question about, you have not you've heard from GCF staff and board members that they don't see clear enough evidence to show how women's empowerment, gender equality results in climate impacts, and how can we address that need. So Jeanette, I'm going to unmute you. If you want to, I've read your question, but if you want to formulate it yourself, and then we'll let TT respond and Don respond to the other quick question, and then do another round. Jeanette?
Yes, thank you, Cindy, very much. This has been a very excellent webinar, so my congratulations to all of you. But this is really something I find concerning, and I'm sure some of you have heard this as well. In the GCF, there has been this pushback from some board members in particular, saying this fund is not a development fund. This is a climate fund, and needing to see very clear. They don't see the linkages in the same way that we all do. And one thing was said to me is, if you can show the evidence somehow that by empowering women in these communities, it results in a stronger climate impact, we're all in. I don't know if they'd be all in, but the point is they have not seen that evidence. It could be in the proposals of the projects, and I'm not that clear about the Ethiopia details, but if the proposal itself is not making those linkages very clear, then I guess it's not that surprising that the board is turning down those kind of proposals. So how can we deal with that need for making those proposals stronger and producing the kind of evidence that the board needs to see?
So, hi, so I'm trying to answer this back to what I already said about the...
Sorry, we're having some trouble hearing, I think. Now.
Oh, oops, wait, closer. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks, TT.
Okay, so back to the things that I already said before, that the GCF put emphasis on the low carbon economic path. So, and then you will see that the money goes to big projects. And then it's very difficult that initiatives from the women from the ground come up, because through the intermediaries and so on. So the transformation, the paradigm shift of empowering is not really as a priority of the GCF. I think, therefore, if we look at the projects, if we look at the policy is there, but there is not enough guidance is actually how to build up a project proposal which is gender sensitive and responsive to the needs of the women, so you can see the climate impacts. I think that's the problem is also there, and there is no if you look at the at our country with the all bottom or all top down approach, so it means it's very difficult initiative from the community that can empower themselves are there on the table. The national designated authority, for example, are still struggling to develop national mechanism of CSO engagement. So, and then how they will do the engagement of women of the community to have projects with a good climate impacts. So of course, if we see there's a lot of examples where the women can are empowered and give impacts to the climate if they are given opportunity and also supported. And I see that GCF is not going into that directions right now.
Okay. Don, may I ask you to address the first question? It was the World Bank.
Yeah, the question on the World Bank.
Maybe repeat a little bit. Yeah.
The question. What it was about is basically, if I got it correctly, if the World Bank is still pretty much influencing the GCF proceedings. Well, to be honest, I haven't been following this very much, but I know that the World Bank is still the permanent trustee, not the permanent, the interim trustee, sorry. And what was interesting, they have been negotiating very long on the accredited master agreement, and they just signed it after the last board meeting, which also caused that the GCF had accepted that they won't approve any projects before accreditation master agreements are signed. And that meant that in Egypt, the 3 World Bank projects were retracted. They will come back, so it's not that they are cancelled or anything like that. But so that is what I know. But yeah, I haven't done a very big study. Maybe Bridget can add.
I guess I think that from my perspective, because I sit on as a developed country observer to the climate investment funds, where the World Bank is the permanent trustee of those funds, and it's the structure of the MDBs is it's the main driver, and it's very, very clearly influencing the way in which the climate investment funds works. I think that there's from what I've heard from many other observers, is that there's a disappointment in how much, even though there has been a lot of fighting from the beginning not to have the Green Climate Fund turn into a fund that funds business as usual, in similar ways to other financing mechanisms, that the challenges that still exist in terms of the high transaction costs that are still there, the ability to finance smaller projects, and also the overemphasis of these, or really the struggle that they're having with almost what Jeanette raised, really, is how do you take what should be a fund that takes a principled approach towards shifting paradigms towards sustainable development that's gender responsive, and that's taking dedicated climate action, but we haven't seen it really move away from that business as usual development model of the World Bank kind of systems. So I think that in the GCF there's less, because of the accredited entities, because it can be many different organizations that are putting forward interesting types of projects and models, there's less of an influence than you would see in, of course, something like climate investment funds. But certainly the overall architecture is taking on some of the same attributes and putting forward, and unfortunately making some of the same mistakes that other funds have made in terms of how that money is being channeled to truly transformative projects, how to break away from this very static climate versus development approach, which the GCF should be able to do. So those, I think, are still remaining challenges.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. Okay, so I am going to move to a question from, and if any of you want to actually speak up, please put your hands up. But there is a question that came on a little while ago from Emanuela Kirima, and asking, talking of accreditation for the Green Climate Fund, what is the qualification for the fund? What criteria is used to award for accreditation? And Emanuela, I'm going to see if you want to actually join, because you do have your hand up here. I'm going to put you on, I've unmuted you now. Oops, having trouble unmuting you. Maybe Bridget has to try. Emanuela,
yes,
no, I can't see. I can't unmute. But Emanuela, I can start the answer to this question, because we are going to devote all of webinar 3 in March to your question, because that is one of the questions that others have as well about the accreditation. How do women's groups access funds, and not just accreditation, but the other ways. So we're going to do a whole webinar on the aspects of the question. But I think we should give a little bit of an answer now. So I'm going to ask which of you would like to give a...
Cindy?
Yeah.
Sorry. Just, could we maybe, because just so we don't run out of time, there were 2 other people with their hands up as well.
Okay.
Maybe we should just get quick comments and then we can
Yes.
give, yeah.
Okay, let's do that then. Okay, so webinar 3, we're going to have the full discussion there, because the detail is quite there. Will you go ahead, Bridget, and unmute the one you're thinking of?
So first I saw Nufo, so I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, thank you a lot for the presentation. Sorry for my English, but I have a question for the Green Climate Funds. It is about the allocation, because even that a lot of agencies, lot of funds are put to help developing countries. Sometimes they don't have money. They say that money is not enough, or we don't have a lot of money to continue some activities. What is the GCF mechanism to be sure that every time, every year, they can have money to continue the activities? Because they are nice activities for women and energy, so we need to continue activity in the long term. So what is their mechanism to be sure that every time they will have donor for money and contribute activities?
Okay, so it was a little bit, we were breaking up a little bit, but I believe the question is about how do you have money to sustain the implementation of the activity, so long-term funding for capacity building for countries that might not have accessible financing? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So, perfect. So I'm going to leave that question out, and then I will also unmute Miriam. Miriam, I've just unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you, and hi all. I'm very happy to be a part of this process. I'm sorry I joined a little late. I had explained earlier to Bridget. My apologies for that. So I essentially missed the first part of the introductory part of the webinar. But all the same, I found some few presentations going on. My question goes to Dan Robin. He talked about the issues. There's some issue within the status of the GCF that I would like to have some clarity on. When you talked about gender in practice and gender on paper and gender not in practice, then you talked about the idea that there are no standalone budgets for gender. And just to be clear, I wanted to find out from you, is it within the standalone, because I'm taking this to be an issue of advocacy that can be picked on, and at all levels, both at national and global level. But just to be clear, should the standalone be within the bigger GCF, or the individual projects that come through should be given emphasis to have standalone aspects that can cater for for gender. And secondly, in term, my other question is about, you talked about capacity building for civil society, and just wondering how practical this can be. Sometimes we talk about capacity building and we lock ourselves into one-off events for capacity building. Thinking this and any other initiative out there at global level should have an ongoing, as issues come in, there should be a dedicated long term and not just a one-off or an event sort of best kind of capacity building just for particular aspects. But going forward, I think it's very important that as time goes on and as events unfold, the capacity building should be ongoing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question. I can clarify on what I meant by no standalone budget. I meant that there's a gender specialist at the GCF Secretariat, but he's paid from a different division. That makes him very vulnerable. We're now in the process, I believe, of having a new gender specialist. But that is what I meant with no standalone budget. I'm not sure if I should answer the other question.
Well, seeing that we are looking to wrap up, I think I wanted to just, I think that Don and TT, it would be great to get your feedback on that last capacity building question. I would just say that I think that part of the intention of some of these initiatives in terms of ongoing webinars, and I wanted to mention on that piece that it's not going to be the same people. This was sort of the introduction of the webinar, but we hope that this entire community of people will engage the upcoming topics of this webinar series. I think that Kathleen and Jeanette both brought up very specific questions on what are those lessons learned from how these projects that are supposed to be gender responsive didn't that they failed to go through or were rejected. And so some, again, as discussions on something specific like that, like how can the projects be improved, is something that we would hope to really dive into in some of the further sessions. And so I just wanted to add to that I think that it's very correct to say that one-off capacity building is really not what we need in this space to be able to really build influence and understanding of how we can really influence those financial flows. So I've put up the future sessions here, but I think Cindy, if you and Dan and TT want to give some final remarks.
Yes, thank you. So I agree that the capacity building should not be in form that you attend one or two sessions, but it's really like like a design program for capacity building. So like one or two, you can do like some years, because it is it's just difficult stuff for us, particularly from the developing country, because you need to understand the documents, and you need to articulate your thought, and you have to discuss with your colleagues of the CSO, and then putting all together into lobby points that you submit, and after that or before that you talk with the people. So it's really a lot of efforts, and the capacity building was really like a programmatic one that's about 2-3 years, and then you have a person that can really but is capable to work by himself, and also to build the capacity of other people. So I agree it should be like it's really designed for that.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I think, unfortunately, and that we are going to probably have to wrap at this point. I'm going to want to add 2 more points. A couple of you have asked about specific books or references. Some things are on the slides. Some also we are intending to give a sort of a list of things, not to say that people have to be reading these things before participating or well, but just to keep flowing the information and so that people have some options. Secondly, somebody also asked about making sure we see questions in the future from each other, so we will work on that as well. I think I want to thank you all for joining this afternoon, morning and evenings for you. And I think on behalf of all of us, organizing and speaking, want to wish you a very good end of year and look forward to really getting deeper into these discussions in the new year. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.